So I'd like to invite the panelists to come up, please. What we thought we would do this morning is we would have a panel that the members of the panel will represent each of the constituents needed for innovation in our field. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. Then we're going to dissect the innovation cycle a bit and just see, what we can learn from each other as we move it along. Why don't we introduce ourselves, starting with you, Richard?
Dick Lindstrom. I'm a practicing. Want to hold one, or can you hear it?
The microphones are coming.
So, Dick Lindstrom, ophthalmologist in Minneapolis. Passionate about innovation, have been my entire career, 45 years in ophthalmology now. Also participated on board of directors, medical advisory boards, and with companies large and small.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear it? Okay? Yeah. Good morning. Dosanjh. I lead Allergan's eye care business in the United States, and also co-chair the R&D for the organization as well. And clearly, Allergan has a clear role to play in eye care, and we're delighted to be here this morning and supporting all the different advances in technology.
Andy Corley. I'm a consultant through Yelroc Consulting and a partner at Flying L Partners. Do investment in primarily startup ophthalmic pharma and device companies. Been in the business 40 years.
Morning, I'm Satvat, scientist by background, partner at KKR. We're one of the largest private equity firms in the world, and recently we've moved into the growth space where ophthalmology is one of the sectors we're spending a lot of time in, both on the device side and the pharma side.
My name is Tom Frinzi. I'm the worldwide president of Johnson & Johnson Surgical Vision. I've spent the majority of my career in ophthalmology, about 35 years now, and have had the pleasure of being part of big, small, public, private companies, and have enjoyed the journey.
Thanks, guys. We're going to start at a kind of a high level and talk about the global megatrends and what the impact is specifically in our field on innovation in ophthalmology. This is going to be somewhat theoretical, but insightful, I believe. Dick, why don't you share some of your thoughts?
Sure. Maybe to start it off at a high level, and I'm mainly an American ophthalmologist, so it'll be U.S. focused, but I think the trends are similar around the world. We have an aging population, and so for us, age 65 matters because that's when people become eligible for Medicare. And over 65, those criteria to look at are cataract, glaucoma, and dry eye and related diseases, and also retina problems. There's also a huge young population, the millennials, and I think the primary focus there where we need innovation to meet unmet needs is in refractive errors. And I think there's opportunity in the treatment of refractive errors with pharmacology, there's opportunities with corneal surgery, and there's opportunities with lens-based surgery.
Other thoughts?
Sure. I think some of the other things related to the aging of the population that Dick just mentioned is clearly the costs of the system are only rising across the world and significantly in the United States as well. And I think what that sort of means, I think sort of the trends that sort of going to imply for all of us is how we actually develop data to support payment and continued innovation. I think the real change probably in the industry over the last sort of 5-7 years is the need to get high quality data to ensure not payment on day one, but payment year 5, year 10, and so on and so forth. And I think, therefore, the actual focus will be on ourselves in terms of how we can generate compelling data versus a standard of care in an unmet need area. So whilst there's many unmet needs, I think we have to raise that challenge and basically think about how we're attacking that, because the cost issue is not going away in any government, in any country around the world.
Well, since we're talking about cost, I mean, every time you watch the news, healthcare is 20% of the U.S. domestic GNP, and there's a good reason for that. That's because that's what's really, really important to the population. I like private pay. Those of you that know me know that I've spent a lot of time trying to bring private payment and private procedures to various markets. I believe that will continuously play a larger role, even if you're in the Medicare and healthcare systems as we go forward. Doctors and patients are in the private pay market, whether they know it or not, because of the incredibly large deductibles that are now part of everyday life for all patients. So no question that the cost of this is very, very important. We seem to be extremely privileged in the eye world because vision is so valued that people will pay for it. And so as long as we deliver a good or service that satisfies the customer, I think we will continue to have the added stability that the private payments that contribute to the stability of our market, which is the private payments supplement the third-party payments. We have a unique situation in the eye world, and I think that's why we have such a robust technology culture.
Just one brief comment. I mean, a lot of our time has been spent in the U.S. with a U.S.-centric lens, and when you look at devices in pharma, that's where a lot of the opportunity historically has been. We've got 20-plus offices around the world, and what we're seeing now in some of the emerging markets, Asia and other places, is people want to and can pay for good quality eye care. And so I think some of the lessons that we're seeing in the U.S. are actually quite applicable in not only a population helping, but also profitable way outside the U.S., and that's something that's keeping our attention.
I think carrying a little bit on Dick's comment about the aging population, as people are living longer, healthier lives, I think it's going to put a lot of stress because there's not going to be enough ophthalmologists to take care of people. And I think by nature, it's going to encourage more MD-OD collaboration because as MDs are more busy doing surgery, they're not going to have time to do standard medical care. And I think that's going to force a symbiosis between optometry and ophthalmology in terms of taking care of the needs of the population out into the future.
Thank you. One of the things I think about a lot, as we're fueling projects to be built and deliver value to the industry leaders is what's going on at the leadership level. And if you think about what has happened in ophthalmology in the last while, Actavis bought Allergan, J&J entered the field via AMO, Takeda acquired Shire, Alcon has now spun out of Novartis. That's a lot of change. That's a lot of change. So what are the implications of those steps and that change on innovation in our field? What are our thoughts? Maybe Tom?
Yeah, no, I think, Bill, it's all positive. I mean, the things you mentioned all represent, big acquisitions with a change in ownership. But I would suggest to you there's also a lot of smaller acquisitions that have happened in the last several years within our field that really help businesses grow, get more efficient, enter new space. And certainly we've been involved in 3 of those. When you look at our acquisition of Tier Science to bring Johnson & Johnson into the dry eye space, our acquisition of Sightbox, which helped our contact lens colleagues really develop a new channel and way of bringing contact lenses through the eye care professional to patients. And then most recently, we acquired a small company in Europe called InnovaLens to really take IOL manufacturing to the next level. So whether it's big kind of change in ownerships like you mentioned or smaller acquisitions, I think it's good, it's healthy for the ecosystem, and I think fosters the continued innovation cycle that you talked about earlier in your presentation.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add to that, Bill, is because I think there's always a supposition that when you're focused in ophthalmology and you're taken out by a bigger company, there's a lack of or a decrease in focus on ophthalmology. And I think actually it all comes down to how you run the culture in terms of how you actually specialize and focus on the business. And I think we've been fortunate in Allergan to have just such a rich history of expertise, so R&D expertise, technical expertise in terms of formulation or drug development, and then also commercial expertise. And you put those 3 things together, those things don't go away, especially if you harness them and culture them. And I think what we've sort of found is actually having extra dollars has actually helped us fuel some of that. So we have 6 programs in late stage phase 3, 2 ready to file, 7 programs in early clinical development. That doesn't happen because you know, you just want it to happen. You have to fund it, and actually having access to more resources allows you to do that. So I think we found ourselves in a position where we can actually be in a stronger position moving forward and actually have a fuller pipeline, and obviously built on a very strong global business. So it's actually, we've sort of reaped the benefits of actually having access to dollars to actually fund more innovation. So
For me, I want even more companies. I hope somebody out there is from Medtronic. I want them in our field. I hope somebody out there is from Merck and Pfizer. I want them to come back in. I think what happened at Novartis and Alcon is wonderful. Two companies went to one, and now they're back to two again, and they're both engaged in eye care. I think that's great for our field. I liked it when AMO spun out of Allergan and has now transitioned into J&J and brought them back into our field. So the best thing about our field is that we still are able to support innovation. So when you talk to your friends at Medtronic, and in my backyard, I've been talking to them every year. I want them in our field. But there's other great companies out there. We want more. So I think it's a good thing.
Is anyone here from Medtronic? Okay, maybe next year.
They're not listening.
If I, for the staff, if you could go back to my presentation, I'd like to put a slide of the innovation cycle up for the panel to talk on. If we could, yeah, perfect. Okay, thanks. So these are the innovation cycles we talked about a few moments ago. Device side, pharma side. One thing I thought we'd think about is where failure happens. Where are the highest risk areas? Andy, you're more a device than a pharma guy. For you, what do you worry about the most? Which stage?
Well, you know, the old innovation cycle, if you're going to write it, it's expensive and it's risky. And risk can appear at any phase of the innovation cycle. Before we pick on a spot where it's most likely to fail, let's just talk about risk in the innovation cycle. And kind of how I approach it is I address risk in three manners. I start with the market. Okay, the larger the market, the more opportunities that you will have. You're going to make mistakes in every innovation cycle. The larger the market, the more chances you have to recover. So we really like to start with a market that's robust. That doesn't mean that small micro markets aren't good. It just means that in general, when you're talking about innovation, the larger the market, the better. The second thing would be the soundness and strength of the technology. Is the technology an improvement or a breakthrough? Of course, that will guide you on the amount of investment that the innovation deserves. And then finally, the team, okay? So you've got market, you've got strength of technology, and then you've got team. And all three are important, but certainly number three has got to be, in most cases, the most important, because a good team can make the risk of the first two reduce. So now, where is the most likely spot of failure for a medical device? So that's more my cup of tea. And I think medical devices have a very solid track record of getting approved. Where medical devices run into tough times is when you have to go and sell it, right? In other words, when you're doing those market models to get your valuation, the people that you hand it off to that are going to actually live them have a completely different opinion of what those look like, right? In other words,
it does always look better on paper.
That's right, it does. It does. And I love hearing corporate guys like these two guys brag about how happy they are these acquisitions they made. We just wish they'd do more of it, right? But actually, somebody's got to sell it. And I think you have to be very, very thoughtful and sympathetic to the team on the other side that's going to have to sell the product. Because all those numbers mean a lot to somebody's career in a corporate environment. So there's always that balance between optimism, realism, and fantasy, right? So when you're throwing one over the tower to the corporate guys, make sure that your modeling is real and it's a financial forecast that's achievable. I think you'll get a lot further in handing these companies
You know,
off.
I mean, Bill, it's interesting when you look at the cycle. Again, I'm a device guy, not a pharma guy. There's risk everywhere. But what's interesting, I mean, you think that most of the risk is mitigated when you're exiting clinical and getting to commercial. And as Andy said, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's the most risky. And we have great examples of that in our market, right? Corneal inlays, going all the way through the whole development process, getting to the market, and certainly struggling in terms of commercial. Visiogen, a lens that went all the way through phase 3, you know, PMA clinical trials, and yet submitted to the FDA at a late stage and never got through. So I think risk is throughout the whole process. And I think most companies underestimate the challenge when you move from a clinical phase to a commercial phase. Because it takes different talent, it takes different skill sets, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's no doubt that, as Andy sort of nicely summarized, that you do listen to some presentations, and yeah, the world's going to change instantly with that technology, and it's going to happen overnight, and everyone's going to pay for it, and everyone's going to be really, really happy. And that doesn't always happen, frankly. And so I think having realistic expectations, because...
Has that ever happened?
So I think having realistic expectations, because you know, people on any side of the table know what they're talking about. So that's just the genuine sort of table stakes to sort of any conversation. So just having a good realization of that. We sort of play on both sides of this. So, you know, we have in ophthalmology, we have a devices business. Our global devices business across the whole company is about a $2 billion business. So we have good understanding of, you know, the whole process through concept validation, feasibility, and so on and so forth. On the drug side, there's no doubt that the scale's higher, the costs are higher, and the timelines are often longer. And so managing risk, I found that it comes down to, obviously you're looking for safety is always a key parameter, especially on the drug side, because a lot of things can come at you from left field. But I think most importantly, what you're trying to do is make sure that when you get to the point of commercialization, you've actually got something that can actually live in the market. And I think sometimes we underestimate those hurdles, because an idea that's 7 years from launch sounds great, but what's the market going to look like in 7 years' time? That is really the hurdle we've got to sort of like look forward to. So
the action item, the action item from what Jag is saying here is that in your startups and in your early stage companies, have a commercial person on board all along the way to keep the reality check in the organization, so that you know, when you're sitting in the office, anything's possible, right? Anything's possible.
Hey,
Anything
Corley,
can be sold.
reality is overrated. You know, these reality checks.
Well, you know, maybe it doesn't pay as well as it should.
So,
and Andy's available whenever you want him. So,
a couple thoughts right from the beginning, which is the observation and invention. I think that's where the ophthalmologist really plays a role. As we're in the arena, we're seeing the patients, we know the things we don't have that we'd like to have. So I think a lot of things, you know, start with the unmet need, if you will. And I think a lot of these projects actually do fail early, and I think it maybe is a good thing they fail early. I think I'm working now with my 8th accommodating IOL company. You know, every one of those ideas I thought had legs when we started. And the trick was to figure out early that either they really didn't accommodate, or they really weren't tolerated, or something, you know, wasn't right. And it's a high bar, no problem with market size, but something, you know, has to work. And one of the things we want to do is, I think, figure it out early. I think the other interesting thing that's really different, since I work in pharma too, is that it's so expensive to bring a pharmaceutical to market that usually the technology transitions to a strategic after a really good phase 2 clinical trial. Whereas in device, we can take it all the way through with venture support, even commercialize it, and then try to find someone to acquire it or do an IPO. But pharma is, challenges are higher. It's a rare group that can really bring a pharmaceutical all the way through the process and to approval and launch without the support of a strategic.
Good thought. Ali, at what stage do you like to invest, both on the pharma side and on the device side in the cycle?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there are differences between pharma and device, but I'd almost say it's less about, what letter of the round it is, or, we do a lot of later stage stuff too, how mature the company it is. I think we look at it for what are the building blocks and sort of what's the criteria and the different variables that are going in. So is there a clear regulatory pathway? Can we actually, with some sense of reasonability, predict, I know it's a strong word, or at least feel good about the path and have that line of sight earlier on? Is there some way to get paid, right? There has to be a quality product that's actually delivering against an unmet need, but is there a reasonable way to get paid in a reasonable time frame? And I think a lot of what we sweat is the combination of the two of those, but do we have enough capital to get it to the right place? And oftentimes these companies take longer and cost more, and are we realistic about the time frame? I totally agree with the comment that I think in pharma things cost, the cost and the timeline tends to be a little bit longer. And we need to be realistic. So then I would come back to the alignment. And so regardless of kind of what stage we're coming in, we're trying to make sure we're not taking a truly binary bet. How de-risked can it be, which is a continuum, not kind of a point answer. But I think the alignment with the team is really important. I think what's interesting about ophthalmology is a really strong ecosystem where you have the clinician involved. And the more you can kind of get that feedback of how is this going to work, not just in the theoretical boardroom, but actually when it's out there in the hands of a practitioner, what does that look like? And so I think kind of combining those into an equation is really what we look at a lot more so than is there any sort of one part of it where this stage is too early or that stage is too late.
Got it. As we're powering through the innovation cycle, iterating, making progress, we want to be acquired. That's the primary path, or take the company public. Okay, those are the two potential exits and path to liquidity for investors and the team. At what stage, Jag, in the innovation cycle, on both the drug and the device side, is Allergan most interested?
So I think, as has already been said, a lot more decisions on device are taken a little bit later than they are on the drug side, because many companies can't take the drug all the way through. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's just a huge sort of endeavor. So there's always that phase 2 point, the proof, phase 2B sort of time, phase 2A, when you've got the dose ranging, that may be the sort of switch point. I think on the devices, again, you want human data, you would love control data to sort of see how it's doing, versus something that's relevant in the marketplace. And so we would prefer in that sort of, if you like, in the drug side, phase 2, and then that sort of concept feasibility sort of stage in device, because once you've already got to market, by definition, the cost is a little bit lower earlier on, but the risk is higher, right? And so I think what we're always looking for is where, the company is looking to sort of put some skin in the game, because trying to have a high-risk asset is we want to de-risk it. The company wanting to sell doesn't want to de-risk it, right? So because there's that cost and risk of actually not working. Well, I genuinely feel that to be successful in this marketplace, we talk about the cash pay patient or the payer. I think the most efficient payer in the world is the cash pay patient. They know value for money pretty quickly. And so in some respects, we've got to make sure that the value we're giving is going to be realizable in the market. And so I think having those tougher conversations in that sort of mid-stage cycle is probably where we have the most benefit and understand where the opportunities lie. And I think it's also most beneficial for the actual companies themselves. Yeah.
Tom, for J&J, what part of the cycle?
Yeah, again, I think the standard answer is somewhat agnostic relative to stage, but clearly later in the development process, when risk has been mitigated for the most part, is where we probably play more often. We're not typically interested in research projects, but at that end of the spectrum, the acquisition we made with InnovaLens is clearly early in the research phase that we believe is going to add value to our manufacturing capabilities. So I think we're open, but clearly our tendency would be later in a cycle than early in a cycle.
I just had one point too. From the investing side, I think what's always tricky is the management team that might be very effective at getting the product to or through development is not always the same team that could get it to or through commercialization. And so I think there needs to be kind of an agreement up front on where you're going, because I think that could make for choppy waters if you don't have an alignment on how that plays out before you go to a strategic.
Yeah, no question. Another thing I thought we'd touch on is inside innovation versus outside innovation. So corporate leaders have to sustain growth, high quality growth over long periods of time. And so you have to balance in some way internal R&D and programs versus external. How does that happen, for each of you? And if I have a project out here and you have a similar project inside, do I have a chance?
You always have a chance, Bill. No, I think again, Johnson & Johnson, I think we've had a history, probably about 50% of the innovation we bring to the marketplace is outside, inorganic, and about 50% is organic development. We're certainly proud of the pipeline we have, and if we have a core competency, things like optics and vision science and materials and fluidics, we're probably going to stay focused internally. But where we don't have that core competency, and it's an area that we think is important to our portfolio, we're going to look outside. But overall, innovation's key, and our freshness index for surgical runs probably close to 40%. So as you look at revenue over the last 5 years, 40% of that revenue is coming from innovation, and I'd say half of it is external and half is internal. And in terms of competing projects, right, if you have something on the outside, for us, we go through a whole stage process internally, a gate process. I would never want to, kind of straddle an external firm with that, but it helps us develop those milestones to evaluate an external project competing with us internally, and certainly we're hopefully going to make the right decision on what to bring in.
So it's a question, obviously, we always get, and a few decades of experience and 125 FDA approvals later, we sort of have a good track record of getting things over the line. That said, there's probably more, to Tom's point, more like a 50-50. If I look at our late-stage programs, the 50-50-50, external, 50 internal, exactly. And so that's the way we're looking at it in terms of, we have a great set of technical people, R&D, scientists. Let's just say, for argument's sake, there's a couple of thousand people who are technical scientists. There's probably another 100,000 outside the company who are probably doing just as good a job on their particular innovation. I think that's the way we look at it, in the sense of there's probably good innovation and better innovation outside the company, as well as great innovation inside. The difference is we have the technical expertise on either formulation, sustained release technologies or device technologies to actually look at those technologies objectively and make some good calls. And so I think you've got to have that internal capability. Otherwise, when you're looking at something out externally, you may be making a bad call in the first place. So I think you need a good sort of blend between the two. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a bad spot once you actually acquire something.
Yep. Okay, thanks for that. We're going to wrap up here in a couple of minutes. I thought we'd touch on areas of unmet need. And Dick, you highlighted some areas that still need a lot of attention. So what's your perspective overall on areas that we need to focus more resources on, and which areas are maybe well-resourced with plenty of either current or pending solutions?
Well, one area that is exploding globally that I think deserves attention of both human and financial capital is the management of refractive errors. When I entered ophthalmology, 25% of the U.S. population was myopic. Now it's 42%. You travel to Asia, there are countries where 95% of the patients are myopes. And then we have the aging population with presbyopia. So at our ophthalmology meetings, I don't think we're talking about that enough. And we should be paying attention certainly to contact lenses and spectacles and advances in that field. But there are pharmaceutical and surgical laser and surgical device alternatives there. So I think that's an area that at some level has been a little bit neglected by ophthalmologists. And then, as I mentioned before, we should look at those things that go along with aging. I'm a big part of several companies in this area, but I would say that the vacuum created by our friends at Actavis and Allergan in dry eye has maybe attracted too much interest. And so, I mean, is there room for 15 new wonderful molecules in the dry eye field? Maybe not. What do you think?
We're still selling. So I think that it comes back to the original point, I think, of what the unmet needs are, the global trends. And this aging population, and it happens at all demographics, so the 20-year-olds become 35-year-olds and so on and so forth. What we're seeing is a capacity potential issue going forward as well. So whether it's a refraction on the myopia or presbyopia, whether it's related to age-related conditions like glaucoma, we've got to find a way to solve those needs, because if the numbers of patients are estimated to grow by 40–50% by the end of the next decade, and the ophthalmologist isn't necessarily growing, then how on earth are they going to be taken care of moving forward? And I think the unmet needs I sort of see alongside the refractive areas, obviously presbyopia is a big consideration for ourselves. We're in late stage phase 3 for a presbyopia medical treatment, which would be the first potential treatment for that condition. But then also, as we look at glaucoma, you know, a condition on the medical side that's been treated pretty habitually by the same mode of action or methods, should I say, in terms of drops. Are there other ways we can give patients much more sustained effect over a longer period of time, which can allow them to basically be managed in a different way? And I think they're the things I see technology is addressing those mega trends actually in an effective way. So I think, and then there's still a long ways to go in terms of either glaucoma management, refractive management, or many other conditions as well, which we're focused on the front of the eye and the back of the eye.
Thanks for those comments, and thanks to the panel for coming up this morning and talking about innovation.